General Committee tasked us with the actual manna scriptures in Exodus chapter 16. And that's the first place we find this what is it material that the Lord provides that turns out it's going to sustain them for 40 years. 40 years. They're going to eat this pretty much every day of their lives for the next 40 years. Now, unbeknownst to them, because they hadn't even received the law at this point by Exodus chapter 16. And the salient verses are at the beginning of Exodus chapter 16. But the whole chapter encompasses really what you could call the Israelite mindset. And we want to be really careful, I think, because we understand as Bible students, and we'll do a little bit of a thought experiment. We've done this before, so some of you may be familiar with it and some not. But we have what I like to call Bible student isms, and we have Bible student behavior. We all suffer from it. It's a virus. We've all caught it from each other. And essentially what that does is it triggers automatic thoughts in our head when we hear certain things. And we're always looking at the antitype, at the spiritual aspect of these things. So I'm going to throw out some words, and I don't need to be a mind reader to figure out if this is a little easier when you're facing a congregation full of brethren and they can respond because we respond en masse, as it were. So I'll just throw out some words. And the first word, I automatically know what's going to come to your mind. So the word oil. Of course, everyone's thinking Holy Spirit. The word water, truth. Horse, doctrine. So we make these automatic associations, and manna is very much the same thing. Manna, when we hear the word manna, we think briefly about what was in the wilderness with the natural Jews, and we automatically gravitate toward the spiritual thinking and the heavenly manna. So my task that's been assigned to me is to suck you back to the reality of the literal manna, not the hidden manna, not the manna that the other brethren will address after me, and I'll try not to, again, step on anyone's toes, but the literal manna in the wilderness, why it was put there, why it's such an appropriate picture for us, really, and some of the unique things that maybe you have and maybe you haven't considered along the lines of manna. So with that, we're going to lay a little bit of framework where we're not going to read a lot of scriptures due to the brevity of time that we have, because we have some points we want to make. So we're just going to kind of do what Paul did and speak and quote scriptures. And most of you are mature enough to know what we're quoting and where it comes from. And we'll probably have many of the same thoughts. But here we are when the manna is first presented. This is actually a couple of months before they get to Sinai. They don't get to Sinai until the third month. They're literally at the 30 days after leaving Egypt, because if you look at the first day of the month, they're actually less than 30 days. They're a short period of time after they had crossed the Red Sea. And we're just going to throw things out there for your consideration. In Exodus 14, we see a pattern emerge very, very quickly with regard to the Israelites in the wilderness. Exodus 14, they have the crossing of the Red Sea. And this is when they murmur to Moses saying, you just could have left us in Egypt if you wanted us to die. Really? I mean, why would you bring us all the way out here, suffer this loss and deprivation if we're just going to die out here in the desert? You just could have left us in Egypt, and we told you, just leave us here, we'll be fine. So that's the first time they murmur. And then, of course, they have the Red Sea experience. And you would think that would recalibrate their their stiff necks and their hard hearts. And again, we want to be careful because they do typify, Israel in the wilderness typifies the church in the wilderness condition, or the Spirit begotten the Lord's people in the wilderness condition. So we have to ask ourselves, would we have been any different when would we be murmuring as well? Because it looked pretty dire that Pharaoh was coming upon them. And then the Lord miraculously opens the Red Sea. They cross over dry shod. That's recorded in Exodus 14. They get on the other side. And then as soon as they get into Exodus 15, we have the song of Moses and Miriam. Miriam sings as well. And this beautiful song that Moses, what a thing if that were recorded, and we get to see that at some point. This beautiful song is recorded in the first half of Exodus chapter 15 that Moses sings. Everybody is just overwhelmed, in just awestruck with the experience they just went through, But 3 days later, they're in the wilderness, and the Lord does this. He says specifically in multiple verses in chapter 14, in chapter 15, in chapter 16, I'm doing this to prove them before they get to Sinai. Let's shake out the loose fruit off of the tree here. I want to prove them. So they come. They haven't had anything to drink for 3 days. And if most of you probably know, there's an old saying that says 3 minutes without air, 3 days without water, and I forgot how long without food. But the real issue is you can't live very long without water, especially in a desert condition. So they were probably even miraculously sustained along those lines for those 3 days where they were traveling from the Red Sea to this wilderness of Shur, when they get to a place that they name Mara because the waters are bitter. And you can imagine this. You have this giant throng of people. They're dying literally of thirst because in 3 days, in desert conditions, renal failure would set in. So that apparently didn't happen. So the Lord did sustain them, but they were despondent and they were going to die. So they murmur again. And I think many of us in that situation would have done likewise, because I've never gone for 3 days in a desert without drinking. So I've gone without drinking, but not in those conditions. So the Lord tests them at Mara, and fortunately, they're forgiven their trespasses, but the Lord says he's proving them. And then at the end of Exodus chapter 15, we have an interesting verse. We won't go into details because it's really not our study, but he says, after this, they were refreshed at Mara, and the Lord brought them to this wonderful place called Elim, which means palm or palm tree. So it says, and they came to Elim, where were 12 wells of water and 70 palm trees, and they encamped there by the water. So again, if you're a Bible student, you're thinking automatically, 12 wells of water and 70 palm trees. That sounds really significant, those numbers, but we won't go into them. So now we'll get into the gist of what we've been assigned with regard to the manna from heaven. So they go through the Red Sea experience and they're saved. They go through Mara and they're saved. They go through Elim and have a wonderful time. And they take their journey from Elim and they go into this wilderness of Zin, or Sin, as we often call it, which is between Elim and Sinai. And this is a month later, after they've seen all these things, but now they're getting hungry. So at first they're going to die. Next, they're going to die of dehydration, and now they're going to die of starvation. And so again, the Lord tries them and says that I'm going to provide you bread and quail and meat. You're going to get meat tonight. You're going to get bread in the morning. And he does it because he says, I want to try them. I want to try their hearts to see if these people are inclined to obey me, if they're inclined to obey me. So not only does he give them the quail and also this manna the next morning when they wake up. Manna is a really interesting thing. So again, we're trying to bring it into, if you understand the type, the actual account thoroughly, all the minutia of detail in the account, the antitype is a much broader picture. So it's important for us to get the salient detail and as deep as we possibly can, put ourselves there as an Israelite and what they saw. So God says, I'm going to prove them. Well, how does he prove them? So first, manna. What is it? We all know that's what it means. What they didn't know what it means, or what it was rather. But we know it was white. How do we know it was white? We're told it was white. It looked like white coriander seed, little itty bitty seeds that, and it looked like when they came out in the morning, especially on that first morning, it must have been an incredible sight. It looked like frost had covered the ground with the dew. And the way manna apparently appeared was it either materialized, or when the dew evaporated, it left behind this small granular material that they could sweep up. And they were to gather, each person in their household, or for their household rather, was to gather what's called an omer. And of course, we understand an omer is not a well-defined measurement. And there's a debate. And it's anywhere from a cup to a gallon. It's probably somewhere in between there. But so each person got an omer's worth, and every household had to collect it. Now think about this for a moment. You're a nation of 2 million people. And it took me a while to kind of get my head around this. 2 million people from 70 in 200 years to 2 million? Really? I mean, that's a lot. Well, in reality, it's not. I did a little research, and just because my brain automatically had a problem with the number, and this was years ago, an interesting fact is in 1610, the year 1610, when they first started keeping like a census, a loose census of people that came to America. In 1610, there were roughly 300 to 350 people from Europe living in North America, on the American continent. 350. By 1810, there were over 200 years later, there were over 7 million people living in the colonies by 1810. So from 300 to 7 million in 200 years, those were under extremely austere conditions. They came to a new land that was not cultivated. There was no civilization. They had to do everything from scratch, and they faced everything that you can imagine. Unlike Jacob and his family, remember when they went into Egypt, they were welcome. They got choice land. They were a part of a metropolis. They thrived in Egypt while they were there for that 200 years until the end, when they began to be oppressed and they began to be hated by the Egyptians. So here we are, 200 years later, there's a couple million of them. How do you feed 2 million people on a daily basis? Now, they don't know, pardon me, they don't know they're going to be there for 40 years. They have no clue. They never would have left if they thought they'd be there for 40 years. But we understand that it ultimately was their responsibility why they were subject to live in the wilderness for a complete 40-year period of time. But we're told that at the giving of this manna in chapter 16, the very last verses, they ate this for 40 years, right until they went up to the Jordan to cross into what would become their homeland. So the Lord gives them this material freely. And the beauty of this is when you're in a wilderness condition like this, classes of people, rich, poor, educated, uneducated, et cetera, they evaporate very, very quickly, because you can only carry what you could carry on your back or your animals could carry. Those animals wouldn't last you very long out in the wilderness. So some provision needed to be made. The beautiful thing about the manna was no one could collect more than an omer. Not that it was prohibited. It was. They were told to collect only an omer. But because anything they took in abundance, any type of advantage that anyone thought they could gain by this manna quickly disappeared. Because obviously, the first thing that happened on the first day they went out, some gathered, tried to store some up and tried to, hoard it. And apparently it stunk really something awful, not something you could hide or conceal. It wasn't like people would go around and say, hey, did you take some extra manna? Come on, fess up. It would be, that tent has extra manna. And, they knew right then and there that they had sinned against the Lord, and they were chastised for it, but they weren't cut off in the sense of disobeying the law. So the interesting part about the manna is not only the gathering, not only what it looked like, not only how it was dispersed, not only that every person was literally on even footing, every Israelite was on even footing. It's interesting that everyone gathered the same amount at the same time on the same days, and that there was no surplus left over. If you were like me, a big guy, and you eat a lot of food, the omer was enough. I might go out and gather what looked like a cup, and I'm thinking, I have to live off of this for 24 hours? That's going to be tough. But no, it wasn't. It was completely filling. It was completely nutritious. It was very light food, because if you've ever done any hiking, and admittedly, it's been a while since I've done hiking, hiking after a heavy meal is torment. So the manna had to fulfill a number of things, so it wouldn't be a heavy meal. It wouldn't be, I realize I'm running out of time here, Brother John, so I'll take just a couple more minutes. It would be easy to gather for everyone. There was no hierarchy, caste system, anything like that. But the interesting thing is day six. Day six. Now, day six is a fantastic thing in the scriptures. Adam and Eve were created perfect on day six together. They were united and created as a couple on day six. They didn't fall until day seven. Jesus was crucified on day six. Remember Elijah in the wilderness? He had a double feeding before he got to Horeb, which, by the way, is where they're going. They're going to Horeb. And by the way, they'll be there in about 40 days. So give or take from where we are here. So a lot of things are interesting about the sixth day, gathering the double portion. The miracle that if you gathered any other day and gathered more, it spoiled and it stunk. On the sixth day, you gathered the double portion. On the seventh day, it didn't stink. It would have stunk on the eighth day, or if you went, you cycled over to the first day again, but it didn't stink. And the amazing thing, another miracle is, of course, when they took that pot of manna that eventually, many, many months later, after the construction of the tabernacle, because it was still 2 months away from the giving of the law at Sinai, that they put that pot of manna that was still edible hundreds of years later. That was the amazing thing. That manna kept in that pot for hundreds of years. That's an incredible, it's a miracle of miracles. It seems very small, but it's not. It's very, it's an important, I guess, picture. If you want to, the Lord is in the details. Despise not small beginnings. So anyway, getting familiar with the manna picture, where Israel's mind was, where their heart was, why the Lord tried them with manna, because remember, food is often used as a teaching tool for animals. It's used frequently for animals. You ever go to SeaWorld? What do they use as incentives for the killer whales and the dolphins to do things? They use food, they use fish, and many other things. And so it was a teaching tool. It was a humbling tool. It was an evening tool, as in not evening night, but evening as far as status, and everyone got the same thing at the same time with the same benefit. And so many things we could go into, hours and hours and hours of stuff, but we'll leave it there.